Welcome back to the Future of DeFi Fireside Chat series. The following is a conversation with Kevin Chou. Kevin is the CEO and co-founder of Rally, one of the first blockchain platforms where creators, fans, and developers together built a creator economy. Previously, Kevin was co-founder and CEO of Kabam, a developer of mobile games with over $400 million in annual revenue, serving over 500 million players.
In this conversation, Kevin shares his profound insights on game economy and on how the blockchain may supercharge the gaming industry, in particular with respect to composable games. He dives into what personal or social tokens bring to society, as well as his giving back to UC Berkeley.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me at the DeFi MOOC. Very excited to be here.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So, Kevin, you've had an amazing entrepreneur path. At the age of 26, you started Kabam and led it to a hugely successful gaming platform, serving over 500 million players, and also having worked with an amazing list of entities, and including Marvel and Star Wars, Fast and Furious, Lord of the Rings, and the Hunger Games. It's really amazing, and sold the company for combined over $1 billion. And then you started to serve as the chairman of Generation G, an esports-focused venture, and also co-founded Forty, bringing cryptocurrency and blockchain to the gaming world. And now you are focusing as a co-founder and CEO at Rally, and a new blockchain ecosystem for creators economy. So it's really amazing. So can you tell us, given your rich experience in entrepreneurship and in gaming industry, how did you tell us about your transition from gaming to blockchain?
The gaming industry has gone through a lot of different changes, and generally the gaming industry has been kind of on the cutting edge of a lot of new technologies. And so, whether it was the Atari and the Commodore 64, pioneering some of the early standalone hardware, to obviously a lot of early PC games and PC hardware utilization, to some obviously internet and some of the earliest applications on the internet. So anyway, what happened when I started in 2006, Kabam, what was happening was there was an intersection of cloud computing and basically games living in the cloud. And this is actually, and ultimately we called this in the industry free to play. And what this meant was that instead of buying the game and downloading it to your PC or buying the cartridge and having it, putting it into your Xbox or PlayStation, you basically played a game and the state of the game was stored in the cloud on the gaming publisher's servers. And when it turns out that when you put the game into the cloud, it doesn't make any sense to charge the consumer to play the game anymore, right? So if you want to play Grand Theft Auto or something, you would basically pay $60. You would buy Grand Theft Auto. You get a little CD. That's great. That model worked for a couple decades. But when you put the game into the cloud, well, then anybody can. It turns out that the right business model was allow people to play the game for free, because you just go into the cloud and you play it. And today we have Google Stadia, and Amazon has their own cloud systems and so forth. And you play the game for free. It could either be or subscription. And then what happened was that you would then the sword you wanted to buy, the skin you wanted to buy, you would basically play the game for free and then pay money for the individual items that you cared about in a game. And that was just starting to come into being in 2006. And today it's a lot more common. And so if you really think about that model, you sort of start to understand, with the current craze of NFTs and owning a digital asset, a digital token, why this crazy world of gaming has been trying to do that for 15 years, of selling you a sword that you quote unquote own, but not really, because once you leave the game, you can't really do anything with it and you can't resell that sword. But in the blockchain world, you actually would own that sword, and it's your if you have a non-custodial wallet, you can now only you can sign a transaction to then exchange that sword for something else, sell it or do something else to it. So I think a lot of early gaming pioneers got bit by the crypto bug pretty early. Probably not as early as you, Don, of course, but but just this I would say probably in 2014 to 2015, in that sort of swing of Bitcoin and Ethereum coming into existence, that there was a lot of gaming, like a lot of people that I respected in gaming, that were starting to talk about Bitcoin and Ethereum and what a decentralized uh, distributed ledger could do um, for the world, and that there was a lot of excitement around it in the gaming community. So that's how I got pulled into it. Was that people that I respected, and particularly a friend of mine who had created a, a Counter-Strike skin trading site using Bitcoin. So basically, you could buy and sell these skins in Counter-Strike, and the way that you would settle your payment was to use a Bitcoin. So he created one of the earliest services, and I was catching up with him, and he said, I'm doing some tens of millions of dollars a month of skin trades in settling in Bitcoin. And I was like, whoa, that's crazy. And this is probably 2014 or so, 2015, something like that. And that was the first time I said, "Oh wow, you could do something interesting with this." And so anyway, that's how I got pulled into the industry. But when I first met him, I was still trying to figure out what to do with Kabam, and so I didn't have much time to research it. And as I think we all know, the first time, at least for me, that I understood what blockchain technology can enable, it was really kind of the proverbial rabbit hole. It's like, oh, that's weird. Let me ask the next question. The answer to the next question just led me to another question. And it's sort of like that happens 100 times before you start to understand anything, in blockchain. So it took me a while to really understand, why why Bitcoin and then Ethereum in the earliest days was interesting, and I didn't get it at first.
So maybe we can further expand on this. So there's estimate showing that the video game market size is about 180 billion US dollars in 2020, and the global cryptocurrency market cap now is um, over $2 trillion now. So so besides using Bitcoin uh, for settling for the trades on these Counter-Strike skins and so on. Um, so what do you think why then blockchain and gaming is a good fit? What is the added value that blockchain brings to gaming? And also what makes cryptocurrency or tokens in general a good fit for gaming?
Well, I think we're comparing apples and oranges when we talk about that value. So the gaming industry, in terms of total, when we think about the size of the market, it's 180 billion in terms of revenue that's exchanged. If you look at, there's not a clean way to look at market caps, because there's obviously like Tencent, which is arguably sort of a gaming company. You have C, you have obviously Activision and EA and a few others. But I think a really illustrative way to think about this is looking at Axie Infinity. Um, so Axie Infinity's market cap is, I think, on a fully diluted basis 40 billion. On a circulating supply basis, I think it's, I don't know, roughly 20 billion. I haven't looked recently. Um, and you look at the number of players, which is a few low single digit millions, which is obviously fantastic. But relative to other games, and the total transaction volume that's happening through that game, it's relatively small compared to a game. So if you could really see, if you take any of the major games, take a League of Legends, take a Grand Theft Auto, take FIFA, take Madden, take World of Warcraft, take all of these other games in the world that have much, much, much bigger player bases and frankly, sort of potential economic transactions. Now, they're of course not designed to be like Axie Infinity, but if you just look at the total player base, the total transaction volume for primary uh, asset sales, it's much bigger than Axie Infinity. So you could argue that something like a Fortnite or League of Legends or something of comparable size, if it flipped the switch to create a full-on blockchain economy, instead of being worth, if Axie Infinity is worth 40 billion, then that other thing could be worth, hundreds of billions of dollars in market cap. So I think that's where the excitement is that you sort of look at the size of what Axie Infinity has started. Sandbox, another sort of game by Animoca that's doing some interesting things. It's trading, I think, a couple $1 billion market cap. I think you look at the size of those relative to established gaming economies, and I think you can sort of see, the potential to turn $180 billion of revenue per year into something that looks like, potentially a trillion, many orders of magnitude above that in terms of market cap.
So besides the economic side, then so what do you think what blockchain brings to gamers, right? And so why? What do you think these large gaming companies out, also these large games? Do you think they are going to all move to blockchain and have a blockchain component? What difference does it make to the gamers and to the gaming companies?
Yeah, so let's look at both sides of that equation. So in a traditional game, you've got the game publisher as a business, creates a game, gets resources together to make an investment and build a game. And then you've got the players. So I'll focus on both sides of them. And then blockchain, of course, introduces a third party, which is a potential speculator or trader or financial actor that can also participate in the economy too. For the game publisher, the traditional model, the traditional thinking for a game publisher is I want to be a monopoly. I want to lock down my entire economy and be the sole seller of goods and services in this economy. And so I think about creating a game, and let's say this game has 10 million players, and some percentage of them, let's say 10%, 5 to 10% of those players will engage in transactions. They will buy something from me. And because I can create the game in such a way that there's no secondary sales, there's no marketplace, the only way that you can buy something in this game is from me from a seller, right? And so that has been the state of the art for 15 years in the gaming industry, has been the game publisher locking it down and selling everything in the market and restricting all secondary sales. There's a few games like Counter-Strike that I talked about, the skin trading, and a few other games that enable secondary sales, Roblox more recently. But in general, I would argue that something like 98% of the market today is there's no secondary sales in the gaming market. Okay, and so that has been the traditional model. And let's say I sell, I choose an item and I sell, and generally, game developers will price things, they'll price things under $100. There's just a general rule of thumb. You price things over $100 and you lose audiences, and people complain that things are too expensive. And so, so let's say I sell a sword for $100 in a game. Well, in blockchain, so as a game developer, know exactly how much revenue I'm going to make. $100. Let's say there's 100,000 people of my 10 million players that will play this, that will pay me for this new item I just created. Okay, I know exactly how much revenue, that $10 million of revenue, I know exactly how much I'm going to generate from that, right? Now, moving to a blockchain world, there's a lot of new variables that we introduce. So it's unclear how this will potentially benefit or not benefit an existing game developer. So instead of selling the sword for $100, could I run an auction like an NFT? Would somebody be willing to pay $1,000 for that sword if they could truly own it and resell it? So, and then the math for a player would be, well, let's say I bought the sword for $1,000, and just like an NBA Top Shot, well, what if the sword prices kind of go up after that? I'd be willing to pay $1,000 if I saw the secondary market for the last sword sale started trading at $1,500, pretty soon after the swords sold out. Well, of course I would pay $1,000, right? And so So that changes one variable is if you introduce scarcity, which generally game developers have done in the past, but because you wouldn't price a sword at $1,000, you wouldn't create there's a trade-off between the number of units sold and then the scarcity and the price. But in a blockchain world, you sort of would absolutely trade off scarcity to create a higher primary sale price, if the math worked out, right? But not only could you, let's say, maybe sell your sword for $1,000, but you could say, hey, every time that sword trades, I as a game publisher, I'm going to put a 20% tax, onto that sword sale, right? And so it's really, we need enough empirical evidence to sort of understand, is the economy better off if I can sell my primary items for more because users feel like they have ownership, and then also put a tax on the secondary transactions. And then from a player standpoint, if you're really smart and you're sort of you create different segments of players. There's certainly players that love this kind of math and economics, and they're going to be really smart about, oh, I'm going to buy this sword, I'm not going to buy that sword, and I'm going to trade them, and here's the best time to trade them. And if you look at like Roblox, there's all sorts of analytics about the best time of day, the best time day of the week, and so forth to buy and sell. It's actually pretty sophisticated, and there's very robust economies that emerge. And so some players will really focus on that. And then some other players who don't have very much time and they're just like, I just want to play this game and have fun, whatever. It's $100, $500, I'll buy it, like I'm done, I want to go play. And so you have this very interesting market that emerges where you have some segment of players that can really focus on the economic, angles. And then of course you take what Axie Infinity has done, which is you open up a whole new world of people who, let's say they live in the Philippines or Venezuela, and they could do a lot of work in the game and provide goods and services for other players. And maybe they're earning $1 a day for doing that. But that could be really interesting for somebody whose average income in that market may be a few dollars a day, and they can actually earn can add a significant part of their income by by participating in one of these crypto economies. And so I think that's an entirely new segment of gamers that have not participated in the gaming market before. And really, one of the probably the biggest drawback to this last era of free to play games is that when you make a game for free and then you sell certain things in the game, you create this imbalance. And so if you have no money, you generally stop playing these games after a while because you're like, well, I can't compete against the person who's going to spend $50 every month to go buy the latest swords. I can't compete against them, so whatever, I'm going to go play some new game. But if you can instead, sort of turn certain group of players into, oh, you can go provide, you can go play this game for 3 hours a day. You could go make $1 or $2 or $5 a day by playing this game in a smart way, and then reselling, providing liquidity, running good, offering services to other players in this game, and just like an economy would. Well, now you get a whole new segment of players that join the gaming economy. So I think that these are kind of the intersection of a lot of these kind of trends that I'm pointing to, which, to be clear, we're still relatively early, is I think why the whole gaming industry is pretty excited about um, NFTs and blockchain technology right now.
And also, it seems that from what I understand, also with the blockchain for gaming, also now potentially the skin that you got in one game, potentially you could, if another game wants to, they could allow you to use a skin in another game. And that completely changes the closed world in the traditional games as well, right? So could you expand a little bit on that? How like are gaming developers going to adopt that? Is that going to make gaming an even better experience?
It's a nuanced question, and I think I think a lot of folks who are early in blockchain, it's like, oh, great, you could take all these different things to all these different games. But I think, the incentive alignment model is really important. And so the the problem I think is that publishers or the people who spend all the time making a game have very little incentive to allow items that are not created in the game to be in their game. Um, Generally speaking, from an economic standpoint, right? If I go invest $10 million to go create a game, and maybe I allow secondary trading and marketplaces to emerge, and I study the economic impact of that, But if I just simply allow other items to be brought into my game, and it makes it very difficult for me to sell anything in my own game, then it's a challenge. So I think the existing marketplace of games probably will not adopt this idea that you can just go bring your other stuff, into my game. However, what I would say is that there's probably a whole new generation of games that are being built right now. And I think the math generally looks like this, where as a game developer, you know, probably half of your budget is spent on building the game, and then the other half of your budget is spent on marketing your game and getting a community of players to understand what your game does and come and play it. And if you create a game that's the go-to-market strategy, instead of spending, like let's say my budget is $10 million to create a game and spending 5 million of it on the development of the game and 5 million on marketing, if instead I just spent $5 million on development, but my whole strategy for going to market was to allow another very popular game, like let's say Axie Infinity, people could take their Axie Infinity, items that they own, and bring it into my game. And my entire go-to-market is not to market my game to new players, but just to market to people who are already excited about Axie Infinity. And I offer a different type of gameplay, a different community, a different way to express, how these items can be used. I think there's going to be a whole generation of games that try to do that. I think Axie Infinity is not quite big enough yet, but maybe it will be in a few years where you're going to see a lot of other games, try to do it. I think, in DeFi, what was really fascinating to me was the way that Sushi Swap went to market, where they kind of vampire attacked Uniswap. And I actually think, like in gaming, I could certainly see, but it is, don't get me wrong, it is a little bit of, for a player, it's a great benefit. Oh, I get to buy my assets here and I get to use it in another place. That's great as a player. But I think if you're a creator of some of these game experiences, there could be this feeling that, oh, I created this game, I created this community, and then somebody else is offering, new gameplay on my assets. We'll see how that works. I could see it being potentially, uh, it could be very competitive or it could be very collaborative. We'll see how the market, works. So I think the incentive alignment for players and incentive alignment for the game developers, like both need to kind of work or there needs to be an equilibrium in the market, I think, for that to be a widespread activity that I could buy something in one game and take it into another game.
You mentioned this collaborative or like cross game exchange of items, which is probably much further than current reality already. But this brings us to this concept of GameFi, which is maybe this pendant of gaming to DeFi. So, what in your mind is GameFi?
So I'm less experienced with exactly that term, although I do. One of the things that I've been following is a number of DAOs that are being set up to basically either invest in NFT assets or create guilds that basically run and provide labor in exchange for earning tokens. Is that what you're referring to, Arthur? Some of these new trends being set up?
Absolutely. Like, I mean, any type of in-game flourishing economy, right? Where you can take your asset that you just earned and maybe sell it on a secondary market, as you mentioned, right? Because in some cases, as you said, the publisher or the game publisher doesn't have the incentive, the economic incentive to allow the secondary market, but in some other cases, maybe they want to, or they want to, and they want to encourage at least the secondary market. So if we want, then we could use this term GameFi to express this open, permissionless market, right?
Yeah. I love the idea of gaming and financial markets, coming together, and I think generally when we think about economies, this idea that you can either provide labor, you can provide labor in exchange for obviously earning a wage. You can provide capital, and invest either long term or short term, into different parts of the market. You can if you have a capital provider and you want to provide liquidity to enable other short-term things to happen. So I think a lot of the things that we see in DeFi are absolutely going to come into games. So this idea that I can, if there's a, for example, take something that's the equivalent of a CryptoPunk, right? I'll just use that because they're sort of a lot more valuable assets with a much more established track record. But I guarantee you there's games like Magic the Gathering that and other games that are sort of similar. We have very well-known markets for certain types of NFTs, essentially. And the ability to collateral, to take a loan and collateralize that, or to sell fractional ownership, of these things, and allow a whole community to participate and own it together, or like buy it together, and then participate in the upside of that. That This idea of collateralization, fractionalization, and liquidity around game assets or NFTs in general is absolutely going to come. This idea that you're going to be able to create an economy where certain types of players can earn, a reasonable, meaningful income as part of their relative to their country's like average income, by providing goods and services that other players in the games are demanding and are willing to trade off their time for. That will absolutely, come. One of the core concepts for games, frankly, when we design games, is the core. There's two reasons why players spend a lot of money in games. One is prestige and status. So I want to buy the thing that everyone's like, oh my gosh, Don has that cool skin or has that super rare, cape or whatever, and everyone knows that that's super rare and it's obviously valuable. And so people are willing to pay the way that you come across other players in the game, people will absolutely pay for it. But the other major thing that people pay for is to save time. And so instead of spending, 10 hours to grind a dungeon over and over again, um, game developers are learning, well, you just, you allow the person to pay $5 and skip that. And you literally do calculations about how much time, you think you're going to allow a player to save, and then you charge a rate that you think that the market would bear for that. That is a core game design philosophy. And so instead of you designing it like that, what you do instead is you say, well, there's somebody, if I'm going to be willing to charge $2, an hour to let somebody bypass this thing, well, instead, what if somebody in the Philippines or another market where $2 a day is a really meaningful, number? What if they provide that service, to a player? What would that economy look like? And I think a lot of game developers are really embracing that, and this idea that you can instead just be the central bank, and you could be the central bank and you could tax the economy, but you could let a real economy, come into being in your metaverse, essentially, that you've created. And I think a lot of game developers are going to be very excited about this. And then GameFi is going to emerge from that as a very natural consequence.
That's beautiful. And you mentioned this idea of tokenizing or of fractional selling, right? Of some of the producers that you create as a gamer. So when do you think will we see this potentially the emergence where what you create in this virtual world you can use now as an asset to borrow real money in the actual in the real world, whatever real means to you, right?
I think right now the fiat bridges are probably the hard, the area that is a little tougher. And it's, the certainly the dynamic, market for regulatory it's impacting more and more countries, right? So this idea that, or specifically anti-money laundering requirements and KYC requirements, um, these are becoming bigger and bigger things. So I think there's plenty of like really exciting things that will happen in terms of, oh, I'm playing this game, I earn meaningful income, and then I like get that into, pesos in my bank account. Okay, that's like one way to do it. But the other way that's actually the flip is happening, which is really interesting, which is if you go to the Philippines, for example, there's a lot of convenience stores that are now taking SLP and AXS as as payment. So I go to the convenience store and I know that I want to I need to buy some food or some whatever for physical. I just pay with my SLP tokens, and it's kind of crazy that there's enough people in critical mass in some of the major cities in the Philippines, for example, where it's pretty common these days for actual convenience stores to actually take blockchain tokens as a payment for a physical item. So I don't know, it's a crazy world that we live in. So then it actually so we're there's a lot of things that are emerging right now that I think are incredibly exciting. But this idea that there's going to be this digital world that you can, participate in, and a global economy that's tied to that, and the ability to exchange goods and services in unique ways. This is a very highly dynamic, market right now.
So, given your experience, your unique experience at Kabam, right, which was mostly non-blockchain based games, what elements do you think will or have worked well within blockchain games?
There's probably three major trends that I'll kind of touch on. The first is that one way that games have financed themselves is to pre-sell the game. And this has happened in either I sell you the CD, like I say, hey, I'm going to spend the next 2 years making um, the next Pokemon game, whatever. And there's customers that love the first game enough, and they're like, I'm gonna put my money down and I'm gonna pre-buy this thing and get the exclusive, like the founder, reward or whatever for these games. And and game companies have figured out that, oh, I can if I if I really think about a brand and a franchise, I can really, and I deliver great products over and over again. I can get my customers to help me fund my next, game, and also create a lot of word of mouth and buzz. The same thing is happening using NFTs. So that what's happening now is people are creating a game, but before the game is really built, the game developers are creating really amazing NFT assets, pre-selling the NFT assets. And one of the nice things about that is that you can run it as an auction. You can obviously secondary markets develop, and so this is happening, and I think this will be more and more prevalent, which is people will use NFT, like basically pre-sales of gaming assets as a way to finance, building the entirety of the game. The second, part that I talked about really is this idea that once there's a game economy going, what are the trade-offs between being a monopoly where I sell everything versus how do I figure out how to be a central bank and tax the economy in a certain way that gives me, sort of, my argument is even if it's neutral, right? Let's say I know, like in the past, as a game developer, I've made $20 million a year, roughly. Um, if I can figure out how to make roughly $20 million a year from just fully embracing blockchain, I would argue that will flip the entire market, because what will happen is that I think uh, it's very clear that when you have your users that actually own your assets and they're on Twitter and on Discord and talking about their game and the value of their sword and like who wants to trade and blah blah blah, like you just amplify the community the way that DeFi or Bitcoin maxis or anybody else like is just talking about the thing all the time, right? So if I could be a game developer and I can make about as much revenue as I made before, but instead I get this community that's really aligned with me and owning their assets and talking about the game all the time, that's great for me as a game developer and probably will make more money in the long run, or my game will last a lot longer. And then the third part that we've kind of touched on is this idea that as a user you can either make an income from playing a game. So I really think play to earn is just such a powerful concept. And and the gaming industry has kind of stumbled upon this in the past, where there's a really famous game called World of Warcraft. It's still around today, of course. But there was a moment where you could trade gold, in the game. And there's a way that I could play the game, I could get some gold, and I could sell it to you, Arthur. And there was a eBay and plenty of other places were just overrun by people selling gold. And we called it gold farmers. And what happened was there's companies in China that would literally employ 1 million people to play World of Warcraft, farm the gold, and then sell it to people in the Western markets. Um, and I think, and Blizzard shut that down because it was not economically aligned with the business model of the game. The business model of the game was I charge you a monthly subscription, to I can't remember exactly what it was, $10, $20, $15. Forget exactly what it was, which is embarrassing. But anyway, I charge you $15 a month, let's say, right? And I designed the game such that for the average player, it'll take you a year to finish all of this content, in the game, right? And then hopefully in that year, I basically create my next thing that you'll then pay another year, for. But if instead I create this game and you're paying $15 a month to play this game, and then you go buy, $20 worth of gold from some gold farmer, and instead that helps you finish the game in 3 months. Well, that's really bad, right? I as Blizzard, I like, okay, now I just screwed myself. And that $30 that you paid for the gold, now allows you to finish my game faster, and then you stop paying your subscription. You canceled your subscription after 3 months, right? That's really bad for me. So, of course, Blizzard stopped the gold farming because the economic model wasn't aligned, right? But this idea that you can create a blockchain economy and the game publisher could be a central banker and could put a tax on the game economy. The users actually own the assets. They could speculate, they could provide capital, they could provide liquidity to the markets, and then you have certain users that are basically earning an income. Now you have like a real economy of labor providers, of capital providers, and a game developer that's being the central bank. So I think that's really exciting, and I think we're going to see a lot of that happen, over the next year or two. All three of these trends are going to really accelerate in the next year.
So we talked a lot about blockchain and games, and also now you are doing so at Rally you are doing something I think is even more cutting edge. You are doing the creators economy and also about social tokens. So can you tell us about that? What do you think in your mind is creators economy? Why is it important? And also tell us a little bit about social tokens and what they can bring to society.
One of the core, sort of technical innovations that we really love, it's like an economic innovation, is what we call a token bonding curve. And so I started really thinking about this because in a game, generally a lot of games will have multiple currencies. So, playing, for example, I used to really love this game called Clash of Clans. It was made by a European developer called Supercell. That game had six different currencies in the game. And so you have these, a lot of the Asian MMOs have like 20 different currencies in their game. And then of course a lot of different types of NFTs and ability to combine it. The reason I started talking about this is that I was really interested in thinking about this world where if you go to CoinMarketCap or CoinGecko or whatever, you look at the number of tokens and there's a few thousand tokens. But what if there's a world that instead of just a few thousand tokens, you have millions of tokens, hundreds of millions of tokens, billions of tokens? What would that world look like? In I think my belief is that we're accelerating towards that world. It sounds kind of crazy to be like, oh, there's going to be billions of tokens. But I remember, and I guess maybe I'm getting older in my tech career, but I remember when Yahoo used to be just a catalog of every single like website, on the internet that was worth going to, right? You could literally just like click a directory of all and this idea that there could be billions of websites in the world was kind of crazy in 1997. But that's kind of the world we live in today, right? And so, of course, just like what Google does or anything else does to facilitate discovery, you're only going to care about a small subset of the billions and billions of tokens. But I think what's obviously like accelerated us on that trend is that anybody in the world today can create their own blog. And even if you don't want a full-on blog, you can micro blog on Twitter. You can go just focus on creating photographic content on Instagram and share that with your friends or a public community. And so I started thinking, well, what happens if, gaming has already sort of accelerated this idea that you create lots of different tokens, lots of different NFTs, and obviously have, a very large number of games each doing this. But what happens if every single person could create their own tokens and NFTs? And I think if I like to do an exercise where I try to think, it's hard to imagine what's going to happen exactly in the next 12 months or 24 months. I think that's actually a really hard exercise. in some ways, some things get easier to predict in kind of a 10-year time frame. And it just dawned on me that in 10 years, it just felt like this idea that anybody can create their own NFTs and tokens was going to be a thing. And I felt like that would be something that would be worth building towards. And so I started thinking about the technology and economics required to do this. Well, if you have billions of tokens, how do you create liquidity for these tokens? Like, how do you create exchange mechanisms between them? How do you value these things? And so I fell in love with token bonding curves as kind of a primitive that you could build around. And so you could think about a big tree of token bonding curves hanging together. So you say, hey, let's say you take one ETH and you put it into a smart contract, and out pops a Dawn coin. And then you could take the Dawn coin, put that into a smart contract, and mint the Arthur coin. You take the Arthur coin and put that into like that obviously doesn't quite make sense. But let's say you take the Berkeley coin, you take the United States coin, you put that into a smart contract, and you mint the California coin. You take the California coin, you put that into a smart contract, and you mint the Berkeley coin. You take the Berkeley coin, you put that into a smart contract, and you mint, the People's Park coin or something like that. And so this idea that you could start with something big and then get down to like a very specific localized thing was really interesting to me. And so I, just the whole point of Rally was how do we, so number one, everyone's a creator. We're all creating content somewhere on the internet, whether it's a video call, photo, a tweet, a forum post. Everyone's becoming a creator in some fashion, and obviously there's creators that are followed by a lot of people and are becoming famous. How do we build a world where anybody can create their own tokens and NFTs? And that was really kind of the founding principle behind Rally is enable that, take this economic primitive of token bonding curves to make it easy for people to create, tokens and have that be bonded to another token that has more liquidity, and that token can be bonded to another token that has even more liquidity, and so that there could be easy exchanges of tokens within the network. Even if you're a layer 2 token and you want to exchange for a layer 3 token, you can make on a different branch, you can do that if you design the protocol correctly. And so that's what we created with Rally. And we're pretty excited that, I think we're still in the early innings of exploring it. And of course, when we deal with people, we deal with KYC and compliance and all this other stuff, especially when we're working with celebrities. But it's been a lot of fun to really think about a world where we try to eliminate technical barriers, try to lower the barriers so that there's no code required to create your own token, and then just allow anybody in the world to create a social token or an NFT that's to represent themselves, their community, their identity. That's kind of the idea behind Rally.
Right. Token world is fascinating as you mentioned, like think about the future where you can have billions of tokens and everybody can have their own token and or they can have many different tokens even. So right, so at Rally you have attracted a range of influencers, including, for example, professional soccer players and so on. So can you talk a little bit? So what made them join, and also how do the social tokens help different types of creators? And also, how do you see the adoption evolving over time? Is it just initially these soccer players, the celebrities, and then it goes down to others and so on?
So I think different types of creators and celebrities have different use cases, and that's what's been so amazing about sort of learning about Rally. So on the one hand, I'll pick on musicians, which have been really innovative on our platform. So musicians, especially in a COVID world, they're doing virtual concerts. They're trying to create a new track or album, um, and the nice thing about music, it's very global. So there's a lot of musicians that have fan bases across multiple countries using different currencies. And obviously, as we all know in blockchain, like when you start talking about a lot of different types of local currencies and the friction to go from euros to pesos to dollars to whatever, and like dealing with that, that's what a lot of people who have like global fan bases are dealing with. And so one of the nice things is that if you have a global fan base, a cryptocurrency really helps with taking a friction out of a lot of different types of transactions. it obviously adds friction elsewhere, but it takes a lot of friction out of that. So I think we see a lot of musicians, for example. I host a virtual concert. People from 20 different countries. I want to buy into this concert. In the past, obviously you could use Stripe and you could use other things. They'll do the currency exchanges for you. It's not the hardest thing in the world, but it's enough friction that I think this idea of using a cryptocurrency is certainly helpful in this idea that I can create my own currency and then fans have to use my currency to basically um, participate or buy a concert ticket. That's something that we've seen a lot of a lot of need for, and a lot of our musicians do that. The other thing that we've like frankly a lot of where the heat that's propelling our growth right now is that we've always imagined Rally to be a place where you can mint both social tokens and NFTs, and you can have them all work together. So in the beginning, when we didn't have our NFTs yet, people would say, okay, well, I'm going to sell my concert ticket for $20, and you could buy my concert ticket for 10 or 20% off or whatever if you use my social token. And people, musicians did that. But now what musicians are even trying is, I've got an NFT. This NFT is the concert ticket. You buy the NFT, and then you use it to actually access the concert ticket. And then for the user or the fan, they actually have that NFT as kind of a ticket stub that shows that they actually went to the concert. And you can imagine that, over the years, you can prove that you've been a huge fan. You've gone to, 50 different concerts over the last, few years or whatever, and that you have a proof, an on-chain proof that you've done that by holding these NFTs. So you get something. So I think we're starting to see just a lot of really cool sort of that types of use case. Of course, the other use case is uh, creators that want to create a way for their fans to grow with them. And so what we see a lot of is creators that say, hey, if you hold 10 of my tokens, and if you hold it for some period of time, you get access to a certain kind of velvet rope behind the scenes. And we're like in it together. And you'll hear, for example, like Taylor Swift, she's got her Swifties, right? So that's happening at much smaller scales where there's sort of, you sort of own enough of the tokens that you're part of the club. And the whole idea is that like if your artist, your celebrity, your athlete becomes more and more famous, not only do you get behind the scenes access to them, but the value of the economy can potentially grow. You can earn tokens by doing, one of the other things that a lot of these people are looking for is somebody to help them edit their videos and put the right filters on their Instagram posts and help them manage their social media and so forth. And so host online events. And so they actually are paying these people or kind of these super fans who are doing work in their social tokens and NFTs. And so it just becomes this really incredible, vibrant economy, and one where, if you have global fan base, if you're trying to do more and more virtual things, virtual events, create virtual collectibles, um, these celebrities are really leaning in. And really before they would be like, okay, well, obviously come to my concert in person, buy my t-shirts, buy my album. Well, think about all the different virtual ways you could create that virtual, NFT now and those virtual collectibles that really allow the fan base to transact and and for the creator to drive revenue. And so that's that's I think what's really exciting about the social token world today.
So exciting how you position the history actually of a fan, right? Like similar to the history of a liquidity provider, right? That maybe gets an airdrop later for being faithful to the protocol. So it's really a very intriguing concept. And also the musicians. I mean, we have seen musicians joining these virtual events in Fortnite, for example, right, where there are like thousands of players around a concert, a virtual concert, which was quite intriguing. So now, if we move away a bit from blockchains, a lot of the game logic, payments, in-app purchases have to be managed in a kind of centralized server. Um, and if we look from a regulatory standpoint, you touched on it very lightly earlier. So, how do you think regulations change when we replace this centralized solution with a decentralized ledger? Right. And what are the lessons that we might have learned from centralized virtual currency regulations that were plentiful, um, Right. So, in your view, basically, how is this virtual currency regulation different from possible DeFi regulation?
So first of all, when we break down regulations and compliance, I think it's easy to say just there's this regulatory compliance, challenges, but there's sort of at least three, major buckets that are very different from each other. Um, I think what you're going to see governments all around the world care about, and I'll start with the one that actually is sort of, at least in 2021, it's the impact is minimal on the industry, which is taxes. Governments are going to care about taxes. If you're a citizen, at some point, sophisticated economies will find a way to tax, crypto. And I think that's probably a good thing. We just gotta, that's something we're gonna live with. And I'm not sure, who knows what sort of burdens the governments will place upon like a game publisher or some centralized entity about any income earned or disbursements or things like that. But we're gonna have to deal with that. And I think that'll be a longer, term thing because it's just something that's gonna happen for a while. The scary thing of what a lot of people, then we'll go to number two. The thing that is actually really scary that people in crypto conflate a lot is um, AML with security laws. And those are two different things. And when I say AML, I mean anti-money laundering. And what this really means is that there's OFAC sanctioned countries, whether it's North Korea or Iran or whatever, or some terrorist organization. Um, the whole world, the United States government, but other governments all around the world care that you're not facilitating the ability for certain types of organizations and countries and so forth to use cryptocurrency and digital assets to finance their activities, right? And this actually isn't talked about enough, but this is generally criminal level it's like that's the really scary stuff. And so I generally think a lot of folks in projects in crypto will really should well definitely will have to deal with AML and relatedly some sort of know your customer type of issues. And I think that's actually, that's really good for the world. And I think we all need to figure out how to do that and make sure that we're in the industry as practitioners that these laws will come. It's a huge, issue. We don't want child pornographers. We don't want terrorists. We don't want whatever, using and financing their activities with cryptocurrencies. And I think that's going to come. And it's actually one of them. It's a thing that people care about. Then I think, my general perspective, and this is probably non-consensus, but then there's security laws. And this is, of course, like a very US centric thing. And I mean, there's a few other countries but this idea that I'm selling a token and that token should not be a security. And it sounds kind of crazy, this idea that you're like this, uh, whether we're talking about a game or a social token or other, other things, like what is a security, what's not a security. Um, and actually, what we've seen is that really when projects violate security laws or the SEC chooses some sort of enforcement around it, it gets a lot of headlines. But actually, generally, whether it's EOS or KIN or whatever, that gets put in the crosshair of the SEC. Like ultimately, if you're trying to do the right thing, but you ultimately like it's a pain in the ass to go through an SEC process, but it actually isn't criminal, generally, unless you're doing something really, really wrong. But it's just it's one of those things that's like unclear. It scares away a lot of entrepreneurs, but it's actually, generally you pay a fine and you agree not to do certain things in the future, and you're done. Um, Now it's not that I'm saying that like anyway, but the challenge to me is that we use this thing called the Howey test, which is like 70 plus years ago or whatever, around oranges. And, like what constitutes a security and these like a very traditional model, like pre-internet, frankly, and certainly pre, blockchain of like what is the security. And I think that's generally served the SEC really well. But I think we're just getting to a world where some of these things don't apply anymore. And so I think we need a modern, post-internet, post-blockchain, like set of legislation that create more clarity around what is a security and what is not a security. And I think we need that. But the reality is like my advice for entrepreneurs and people in the space is that, in DeFi, like I know this is a DeFi MOOC. I think DeFi is going to be in the crosshairs of the SEC. Because anytime you talk about lending and borrowing, anytime you talk about, some of these other things, they really do have historically fallen under the SEC's jurisdiction, and it's challenging. But I think if you're creating a game, you're creating other things, it's like, well, it's probably, the SEC is at the end of the day like a group of humans, sitting, in DC trying to figure out how to, enforce and provide, regulate markets. And there's only so many things that they can go after. And the blockchain world is just exploding. And so, you know, I think try to do the right thing. I generally think like as practitioners in the industry, we should really care about AML, like anti-money laundering. We should try to do our best to help, people who want to pay their taxes, figure out how much taxes and how to report on that. And I think, the regulations will evolve, and I think we should all get involved in the political process to make sure we all have a voice, there. But I think compliance and regulatory is actually, just by saying regulations and compliance, it sort of conflates these three different things. And in some ways, the security law thing gets a way bigger sort of, um, uh, you know, more attention than it should. Whereas actually, I think like the AML issue is a much more real issue and one that comes with real criminal prosecution if you're not doing it right. And so anyway, so that's my view of like regulations and compliance. It's a little bit nuanced, and sorry for rambling a little bit.
Yeah, it's really great to hear how you clarify and essentially separate out these different issues and brings clarity to this. That's great. Thanks a lot. So now let's move on to your entrepreneur side. You've had, as we discussed, you've had such amazing and rich entrepreneur experience, and I think our students and in general the audience have would love to learn about the lessons that you've learned from your entrepreneur experience. So first, so DeFi is still in at its very early stage, and also especially there's a lot of challenges in usability. And you have created games with hundreds of millions of users. So I think maybe you can share a little bit about your experience in how you design and validate user interfaces or user experience that attracts hundreds of millions of users and gamers. And how do you think how such experience could help on the general like blockchain and DeFi and social token side for user experience?
One of the things that's very common in the gaming industry and for big consumer internet companies, there's an acronym called FTUI, and it stands for First Time User Experience. And generally, what game companies and big consumer companies will do, they'll measure every step, every button you click, every message you see, and they'll look at a drop-off rate. And I can tell you, like for example, for most games, that you would play today on a phone, you go download a game, you play a game. There'll be 50 different steps that a game company will measure. From the time you like download and the first thing you do, the first thing after you tap into the app icon, all the way to it drops you into the game. There's generally 50 plus steps that a game company will measure. And any consumer company, like if you're using Pinterest, you're using Instagram, you're using, whatever, there's like also the same thing. Like literally every little step, every click, every message is measured. And we could tell there's like drop off rates, drop off rates, drop off rates. And the easiest way to, when you're talking about tens of millions of people coming into a game, we literally look at every one of those 50 steps, and you might say every step has a, like, and it's you would like what's crazy is that you measure 50 different steps, there's drop off at every single step. Um, and every step maybe only be like 0.5% or something like that in terms of drop off. And then there'll be one step that has 5% drop off. And of course, as a product and engineering team, you would say, all right, let's rework that step and let's not get 5% drop off. Let's go make it more like 0.5%. And so you have this fatui, you get people coming through, you lose some people in any of that process. And a good consumer product, you're getting 70, 80, 90% sometimes, through this fatui. I would say I've never heard of a single crypto company measuring a fatui. I've not heard, certainly not heard of DeFi, but I would guarantee you that that Fatui, conversion process looks abysmal, compared to industry averages of 70+%. It probably looks like subs, single digit percentages, right? So because what's happening? Because you're forcing a non-custodial wallet, right? Which is great. Like I love that about the industry. I'm certainly not advocating but I think when you say somebody's got to get a MetaMask or some other Web3 wallet first, they've got to figure out how to get some Ether into it so they can pay for a transaction. They got to figure out how to validate and allow a transaction, an application to even send a transaction on their behalf. Like all these things, like are super confusing to even experienced crypto users. But certainly, if you're first time crypto user, it's like just mind-numbing in terms of the number of things you have to do to actually use the application for the first time. And because we're in a decentralized world where generally the wallets are not integrated into the application, right? So you can't even measure it as an application developer. I can't measure what my drop-off rate because if somebody comes by and they don't have a wallet, like they can't even start the process. So I think I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges is and this is why I personally, again, non-consensus, but I personally advocate, and I think we need tools to make it easier for an application to create a custodial experience as a first-time user experience. I know this is again non-consensus, and it's expensive, to do on Ethereum. So it's one of those things where I think the next generation of chains, I hope solves some of these problems. Like how do we lower costs so that, for example, I could create a custodial experience for a user. User can understand what the application is trying to do. They can understand what ownership means, and then okay, great. Like they could do a 50-cent transaction. They could do a 10-cent transaction. They could do a dollar transaction. And then when they get to, and they could do that custodially, and then when they get to, let's say a few hundreds of dollars of value in transactions, well, maybe they at that point they want to figure out how to set up their own, Web3 wallet and move their assets into a non-custodial experience. I think that's what's going to be necessary to get, 100 million new users in the crypto, or the next 100 million users in the crypto. I think it's not the only way that will happen, but I think there's certain types of segments of users that will require just a more, it's just an easier on-ramp into a product. So I think that's probably one of the things that is so different about my experience coming into crypto was this idea that I can't measure conversion, I can't measure the drop-offs, and I know that if I'm going to require a MetaMask wallet or something else to log in to use my application, I'm going to get a massive drop-off. That's probably one of it's both an incredible, like, if a user navigates all that, there's certainly going to be a great user. But on the other side, you're just going to lose a lot of users. And so I think that's kind of one of the biggest challenges is, is that, in the industry. So I don't know, again, it's a little non-consensus to say start people off on a custodial experience. But, the other reality, I think the other thing I like to point to is Coinbase itself or Binance or something else, right? Like if you're forcing somebody to figure out how to get Bitcoin into a Bitcoin wallet and mine it and do some other things, like the market only grew so much. And then Coinbase came along and said, you know what? You want to you want to get some Bitcoin? Great. You create an account, username, password. You go, hook up your bank account, and you could go buy you could buy some Bitcoin. You don't have to figure out how to do a wallet and all this other stuff, right? And arguably Coinbase and now other exchanges that are centralized have grown the market of crypto participants quite a bit. And I would argue that if Coinbase had a non-custodial only approach, it wouldn't have grown the market as much as it has.
Right. So right now, I think users are not used to having their own wallets and so on. It's just like in security, also it's been difficult to educate the users about how to use public key cryptography that has been, decades in the work.
Right.
But do you think in the future it's just like people didn't have mobile phones, and now everybody, most people, they learn how to use mobile phones, and then in the future, maybe most people they will have their own wallets, and hence that will become more of a common practice and no longer a barrier for user adoption.
So to be clear, I like this not this custodial, non-custodial thing, I think is it's a moment in time. And I do think, Don, I agree with you. Actually, one of the things I'm so excited about crypto is I think it is teaching people public key, private key, and how to navigate that in a way that I think people will care about. So I think once you start using a non-custodial wallet, it becomes trivial and it becomes easier. And then like, but if we go in, obviously there's a lot of different estimates about how many people in the world are using crypto. But let's just say it's somewhere between, I don't know, you're probably a bigger expert than me on this, Don, but let's say it's 100 million or 200 million, like somewhere in that range, which includes a lot of, custodial, like exchange only, users. Um, so I think just like, smartphones, we need the killer apps, right? Like I think the reason why the iPhone took off and things like the Palm Pilot and plenty of other things that try to do something sort of similar was like the iPhone just, lots of reasons why, but I think there's this idea that it was like easy enough to use. I think it combined, separate from like the Palm Pilot and a few other things, like you can make phone calls with it. And there, like here's another crazy thing, right? I actually think like smartphones, it was driven by you can make a phone call. It was like the killer app was phone calls and SMS, text messaging, and email. Like those were the killer apps of the early days. And if you watch any 18-year-old use a smartphone today, they're not using any of those things. They're not doing any of those things anymore on a smartphone, right? But it was a moment in time where getting, billions of people to buy a smartphone was like you can make a phone call with it. You can check your email. You can surf like some basic websites and send a text message. Like that was enough to get billions of people. Like those things were the things that got billions of people in. And similarly, Don, I think that once we get billions of people using like into crypto, like in a non-custodial in a custodial way, and they start to figure out the custodial, I think the world won't look back from a security model standpoint and from a usage model standpoint. Non-custodial wallets are where we're going to be in 10 years, and I'm super excited about that. But I'm also pragmatic in that I think to get the next hundreds of millions of users into figuring out this new Web3 world, we've got to make the onboarding process a lot easier and create some killer apps that are easy to use, for those next hundreds of millions of people to come in.
So maybe we can then next broaden this further. So far you shared great lessons in the user experience side, but you also, like being a successful entrepreneur, I know you must have, had to deal with a lot of different aspects in entrepreneurship. As I understand, even your first company, Kabam, initially was started as a social media website, water cooler, as a competitor to LinkedIn, and then later on became Kabam, right? So maybe more broadly, could you share what important lessons you think and recommendations for early entrepreneurs about how to be successful in entrepreneurship?
So the first skill that is, there's no like it just takes some time to get some experience is like you have to building a team that covers enough of the functions. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs fall down on this or have a hard time figuring out how to recruit and get a group of people with different sets of talents together. And so obviously if you're going to be in crypto, you need you need the engineering teams. Even within engineering, there's different types of engineering. Like if you're going to launch an application, you need front end, of course, then you need the smart contract engineering. If you're going to create custodial, anyway, it's like you need different types of engineering and developers to build the product. Um, the other side of the house is, of course, navigating the go-to-market. And I think, engineers generally have had a hard time figuring out like who is good trying to at go to market, and then vice versa. People who are really great at the business and go to market, have a hard time evaluating technical talent. Um, And so I think you need like generally to create good products and create a good successful entrepreneurial venture, you need to get like a balanced team to go from zero to one. And then I think the hard thing for a lot of entrepreneurs is generally the go to market. I would say even for pretty good business team business oriented teams, the go to market is generally harder than the creation of the product. Not always. There's obviously very technical things, but um, getting once you build the thing, how do you get people to use it? How do you get people to care about it? How do you get um, what is the right beachhead? What is the right segment of users to really, go after and make sure they love your product so that you can grow and grow and grow from there? That is a hard thing that the and oddly enough, the only way to get that experience is to be at a company that is going from zero to one. There's literally no other way to get that experience. If you're Apple, if you work at Apple or Google and you're working on a new product at Apple or Google, the reality is you get all the resources that Apple and Google have to help you go to market. So even if you're launching a new product at a bigger company, you kind of get a little bit of that experience, but not nearly in the same way as if you're going to be a startup trying to figure out how to get your initial customers or users to care about the thing. And I think that's and it's a hard. I don't have any hard and fast rules, beyond it. I've got a few different playbooks that I kind of think about, but it's really an art, and it just requires a lot of attention and thinking about it, and understanding some of the blueprints of what works. And there's no one way to skin a cat, but there's like thousands of ways to do it wrong, and maybe a few dozens of ways that you could do it right. And so it's like really understanding how to think about a go-to-market that and kind of studying history, studying how other companies did it in the early days is generally helpful. And so I think all of those things are generally some of the stumbling blocks that early entrepreneurs have. But I would close by saying that all of these are very much surmountable, and it just requires, some level of persistence and really trying to get to first principles, what's working, what's not working. So first principles, persistence, and being honest with oneself about is it working, is it not working, and then figure out the next step from there.
And you talked about it's really important to build a, a balanced team that covers different functions. So, of course, building team itself is challenging. Can you also talk a little bit about what you do to build teams and what are lessons for people to learn how to build teams?
Most interviews focus on experience and skill sets, and that's important. And it's really important at a bigger company where you have jobs are very, very specific. The bigger the company, the more specific the job. And then so skills and experience matter more when you're trying to get to a very specific thing. But at a startup where you're trying to think, oh, like maybe you have three or four people that you're starting the company with, or like the average person is two people start a company, right? So between two people, you got to figure out what are the things that two people are going to do to cover enough ground to make real progress. And I think the most important thing when you think like what does two people need in common, it's not skills and experience. It's do the two people uh, complement each other, have a healthy communication style. It's almost like marriage counseling or something. It's like, can two people or three people or four people, however big the initial founding team, as well as, then you recruit a few more people, right? You got 10 people, you got 15 people. I would argue that anywhere below 30 people, how does that group work together? How does that group communicate? How does that group understand what the objectives are? Um, and again, you still need functional experience to accomplish certain things, but whether that person has 5 years of experience at company A or 7 years of experience at company B or failed at company C kind of doesn't matter. What's more important is that they have some sort of experience in that function. Maybe you need somebody who's a marketer, maybe you need somebody who's a communicate or in communications or PR, you need somebody that's going to be a front-end engineer. Yeah, find somebody with reasonable experience, but most importantly is how does that person fit in? So I always look for a cultural fit first and foremost. And so I try to talk, when I talk to people, I generally look for people who can be honest with themselves. I look for people who can take feedback well, and I look for people who are natural sort of collaborators and very open, with things. I look for people who are open-minded, who aren't so stuck on a very specific position that they can't consider the other side. Um, so anyway, so I look for a bunch of different things in people first, and then I try to assemble like the different skill sets. But really, it's generally how well does the entire team work together that's much more important than the strength of any one individual on the team in the earliest days.
This openness reminds me quite of Ray Dalio's idea of meritocracy, right? Where you're being as transparent as possible with your colleagues and to give suitable feedback. Very well put. Yeah. Um, so, in speaking about the future of DeFi, so you've laid out how the user interface or the usability has to be really important, and that sometimes maybe a custodial approach is maybe simpler and more healthy in the early stages, which is difficult maybe for some of our more technical audience, right, to understand or grasp. So it's a very keen insight. So besides the UI, what do you think do we need to bring the next 100 million people into blockchain and crypto?
Apart from UI, I think it's new types of products, new segments of products. Um, so I think if we look at the history of blockchain, and starting with Bitcoin, you basically had Bitcoin as just a pet. It started as a pet rock. You couldn't do anything with it, by sort of, like it was so elegant and security was so high. It's like, great, you got a pet rock. Like, it can't do anything. And that was cool. And of course, Bitcoin became more and more valuable. It became like gold, and then maybe now it's diamonds. Who knows? Whatever your analogy is, like the thing doesn't do anything; it just sits there. Um, so then you get to the first versions of Ethereum, and now you've got some basic smart contract functionality, um, and now you could do a little bit more with it. But maybe like all of the earliest applications were sort of a little bit weird and wonky, and so it's like, well, what can you do? I think actually, in the whole name of this class, I think DeFi really became one of the first like different things that you can do with blockchain. And so you could create an application that says, hey, I'm going to create a lending and borrowing pool, or I'm going to create, a new stable coin that's algorithmic, or I'm going to create, whatever it is, right? Like, great, that's like it's a different product than what Bitcoin was before, where you just held a token, you held a pet rock, before. Um, and so I think like DeFi was the first time that you could be like, okay, it's not just a thing that I hold in a wallet anymore. I can do something with this. And then there's financial products, and of course, an explosion of financial products and exchange, dexes and other things. And so I think that DeFi brought a lot of new people into the space, and they were very financially oriented. And then I think what's been so exciting about 2021 is that with NFTs exploding and social tokens and DAOs, they're very different products and user, needs that are being addressed with these different things that are also on blockchain now. But we haven't seen yet sort of, I would argue that aside from UI, that there still needs to be new types of product, categories that get created, right? So I think, unicorn within blockchain, just to throw one out, is like social networking. Social networking has just been a thing that's brought a lot of people, into the internet. um, and um, and one could argue it's very broken, with the whether you care about the politicization, false information, whatever it is. Point is, and we're not going to solve like that's not what blockchain is going to solve for sure, but it's at least solving the core business model of catering to advertisers only, right? So how do you create something, for example, like how do you create a social network on blockchain? Like what would that even look like? There's been lots of attempts at this, and I think there's somebody that's going to really crack the code to create a social product that whether it's your identity, whether it's your social connections, whether it's whatever. I think that's gonna that's something that's coming. I love like brain trust as another sort of idea, like a labor marketplace, kind of a Fiverr or whatever. Like so, I think that type of like that's a new type of application and product category. So I think we're just kind of in this stage now where can builders come and build new things using the primitives that are available to us, as well as the new blockchain technologies that are coming to market that lowered the fees and which I think is super important. Like the blockchain isn't useful if you have to pay $100, to do a transaction, to do some computation and store some state. Uh, it's just really hard. So we got to figure out how to scale it and lower the cost, and then you can build something that is like a social network or something else that how do you do some of those things? Some of these other product categories, I think, will emerge as we get the cost down and the scalability and throughput up. And I think that'll like new product categories is just key to bring in the next 100 million users. And to get some of these new types of product categories, we just got to continue to solve the scaling problem and the cost problem in blockchain.
The social tokens and creators economy, that's also a new product category that you're working on that actually helps bring more users to the ecosystem. Yeah, thank you. Right. So now, also moving on to talk a little bit about your personal lessons and so on. So, as a Berkeley alum, you serve on the board of trustees at Berkeley, and also there's a beautiful Chou Hall on campus as well. Thanks a lot for the donation. And also, more generally, thank you for giving back your precious time and huge support to Berkeley and also to the general education system. And so, can you share with us why you chose to be on the board of trustees and what's important to you? Why do you, give your precious time and support to the university?
I don't think I would be on the track or have achieved what I've done without my time at Cal. And I talk about my parents moved to immigrated to the United States a year before I was born, and they came with very little. So I grew up in a very modest background. We were always, kind of a little worried about money and trying to figure out how to fit in and adapt to this new country. Um, and so I went to public schools my whole life. And then when I was trying to figure out what college I was going to, we didn't really have enough money even for a public school. And so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to get financial aid, and the financial aid office at Berkeley was actually really helpful. My dad lost his job from the time that I applied to the time that I was going to become enrolled as a freshman. So we actually talked to the financial aid office at Berkeley, which was super helpful. Um, and so I just think there's karma, and I think that there's while there's some things in my that a person can control about their own life in terms of how much effort you put in and a few other things. Like I think I certainly believe that I'm really lucky. I'm really fortunate. I've been a part of a public school system that's given me much more than I've got it. Certainly given me more than I put into it, even with a lot of donations. So I feel like we have to support public goods. Like I think we see this in blockchain. It's like we're also trying to figure out how to support some core open source basic R&D and make sure that works. And so anyway, so I think so to me, public schools, public education, public university, like especially the quality of Cal and the community that we have, it's worth supporting. It's worth fighting for. It's worth making sure we keep these institutions a lot, give back to them in whatever way we can so that it can continue to provide incredible value. Um, yeah, I honestly think that I wouldn't get to do what I do today if it wasn't for just a lot of luck and the education and community and ideas that I was exposed to when I went to Cal.
It's amazing how humble you are, and I completely agree. Yes, for especially for public university, like for private university, often they have huge endowment and so on, and it's been challenging for the public university to match that. So yes, I think your contribution is particularly really important for public universities, and also it's a great that and recently UC Berkeley has been ranked the #1 college in the United States.
By Forbes. Yeah, I saw that. Actually, I was just looking today that the U.S. News, is ranking, not first, but I think it's put UC Berkeley fourth. So, globally. So I think that, yeah, UC, yeah, I'm just such a huge fan of everything Cal. So I think it's worth giving back to.
And also, Berkeley has been ranked the #1 US university in blockchain as well.
Oh, really?
Um, yes, yes, yes. Right. And yeah, a lot of really exciting activities in the space on campus also.
Amazing. Yeah. You started Kabam, right? Also at a very early age of only 26, age 26. So we were kind of wondering, did you play computer games at an early age? And what was kind of your first computer age experience back then, right? And or more generally, what age did you get into accessing a computer and playing your first or installing your first games?
Yeah, my uncle and my dad they were technology geeks, and so they were always like scrounging around parts and building, computers. And so I remember having computers and PCs relatively early. And so I would play, back then they were called shareware games. And so, you would put back there it was like on a floppy disk and you put it into the PC and there was no hard drive. A lot of, in the early days, I remember the PCs, the ones that I was familiar with didn't have a hard drive. And so you would boot off the floppy disk itself, and so and then there would be shareware games. So like you would see a message that said, "Hey, if you like this game, consider sending $5 to this address," and people would literally like put money into an envelope and mail it to a developer, and that was shareware games, and you were encouraged to basically take that game and just share it with your friends because the whole idea was like if somebody really liked the game, they maybe just would put $5, put a little bit of money in an envelope and mail it to whoever created the game. Um, and so there's a lot of games that were created like this, and they were really simple. They were like Pong-esque, in terms of some of the quality of a lot of these things. But I remember some games like there was this game called Decathlon, which was really fun. It was like a multiplayer game. So yeah, two people sit at a computer, and like one person would use like, the one and two key to like do things, and the other person would sit on the right side and they'd use like the O and P keys, and you'd like compete against each other in like a race or whatever. Um, and then I taught myself how to code or really hack around some games, in the when I was a teenager. So I kind of, I never got formal training in computer science, but sort of hacked my way by because I wanted to build some games as a teenager. Um, and back then it was like there's these things called BBSs, and it's kind of early precursor to the internet. And so I was kind of hacking around some games that you could play there. And that's yeah, so that's how I just always loved games growing up, and never thought I would make a career in it. And so I think my general advice to people, which sounds a little bit of a platitude, but it's like go. People say, "Oh, go pursue the things you love" or whatever. But I kind of think like figure out what's weird and wacky about yourself and go like there's today on the internet you can find millions of people that share the same weird wacky things as yourself, and go figure out what that looks like. And I think we're just in a world where entrepreneurship and change is coming to everything, whether it's energy because of climate changes, whether it's biotech and food production to obviously even what money is today with crypto, to automotive industry being upended with electric vehicles and self-driving, and AI is gonna roll over a bunch of other stuff too. So like almost any industry you could think of is being impacted by change and generally driven by technology. And so I think exploring the edges of what that looks like is really where entrepreneurship thrives. So don't try, I think generally try to think about like the super weird and wacky that that you have a lot of curiosity about, and that's what I recommend, like figuring out how to go chase that, because that is where the opportunities are going to be in the next few decades, is just on the fringes, and the fringe is expanding so much more rapidly, now that there's so many different fields that are being touched, and whether it's data, AI, big data, AI, machine learning, cellular, genomics and other cellular, understandings that we have. It's just like the world is crazy right now, and that's what's awesome about it. So I encourage everyone to go, pursue the weird and wacky as an entrepreneur.
We noticed, like, I mean, that while entrepreneurs try to push the boundaries of what's possible, right? I mean, first principles thinking, and trying to really like 10x wherever you can. Many parents try to kind of confine or protect their children by, for example, not exposing them to computers or games early on. Um, so how early in life do you think that a child should get access to computer or games in general, and maybe how much is too much, or is there even too much?
It goes back to first principles. I think I and something. I'm married with kids, and so my wife and I think of trying to think about what's really important to our family, what are the values that we have, that we want to bestow. So we have our five core values as a family that we really care about. And then I think then whether you're looking at, so I think then the idea of like screen time, when does your kid get a phone, and how much, what do you allow them to do or not do, for how long, those things are a little bit more tactical. But I think it's, get the overall foundation in place of like what a family cares about, what are your hopes and aspirations for your kids, and all figure out some of the bigger questions, and then I think then this question of exactly how do you tackle screen time and games and other content, and you know there'll still be debates about it, but at least they'll be more grounded in like the overall direction of what's important, for a family. So I think, anyway, I think it's very personal. I don't have any specific recommendations around it.
So this is a question we ask every speaker in the series. So what's your favorite book or books that we love to that have recommendations for the audience?
Well, I used to read a lot of science fiction. So a lot of my favorite books are sort of sci-fi or fantasy. I have a bunch, on my shelf. The one book that I generally have no problem I think one book I recommend is the Three Body Trilogy. I think it's relatively more common these days, so I feel a little bad recommending it, but I still think about that book, quite a bit. I was having a conversation earlier today about it, so I still recommend that book. I I fell in love, like recently. I've been really thinking about what's possible in medicine and aging, and so uh, I read this book by David Sinclair called Lifespan, which is really interesting. So he talks a lot about what's possible if you really think about what's happening at a cellular level, and what does aging really mean in an organism, and what are things that we've learned now about humans aging? Uh, how do we look at that in the context of the entire lifespan of humans? So it is really amazing to really think like we all know that the average lifespan of humans have gone up over the last few centuries, but like why? What's causing that? I mean, is there any theoretical limit? What happens if you remove, at any given point in time, like if you look back 70 years ago, the major killers were tuberculosis and pneumonia, and like you know things that people don't really even die of anymore, right? And now it's things like you know heart disease and cancer, and a few other things. Well, what if you remove all those things? What if those things are not what people die of, in a few decades? Like what then? Um, so, right, fascinating book. Highly recommend that if you have any curiosity around that kind of stuff.
Besides book recommendations, I'm sure the audience are very curious about what is your favorite game, and also in general, Do you have recommendations for games for team building?
Um, well, my favorite game of all time is StarCraft, Brood War. Um, just such an amazing game. I don't recommend playing it these days, although they did remaster the game and re-release it a few years ago. Um, I think in terms of team building, I do. I used to recommend a game called Overwatch because it was easy enough for people to kind of get into it, and it has very different roles, and you have to figure out how to work together as a team to really, to win. And so it was actually a really fun game that we used to play in the office when we were back in the office when we had an office, sort of pre-pandemic, with other teams and other companies. League of Legends is another one that is really good, I think, at team building as well because of different roles, on a team. It's also obviously a very old school game at this point, but still obviously incredibly popular. And so, yeah, I still play a lot of League and Overwatch, which are not very new anymore. Valorant is the other one that I think a lot of my friends are playing, but I just been too busy with blockchain to pick up Valorant. Um, so yeah, so I think those are some games I think to consider. Um, I generally like those more than first-person shooters, and well, Valorant is a first-person shooter, but I generally like these more than some of the like proverbial franchises like Call of Duties or Battlefields and things like that.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Kevin, for such amazing and wonderful fireside chat.
Yeah, thanks for having me.